Welcome back to the Canadian Concussion Center's webinar series that's sponsored by LIUNA, the Labor's International Union of North America. I'm Leslie Rattan and really pleased to be moderating our webinar series. If you haven't been with us before, our webinars occur every other Tuesday evening from 6 to 7 p.m. And just so that you know, all of our previous talks are archived. The recordings are archived on the Canadian Concussion Center website. So you can always go back to view those there. Before proceeding any further, we'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we were on today. Even as we meet virtually, it's important to recognize the lands we each call home and reaffirm our commitment to improving relationships and understanding the local with local Indigenous peoples. From coast to coast, we honor the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. So back to our webinar series. Again, if you haven't been with us before, usually the first half of our webinar, we have an expert speaker who speaks to some aspect of concussion. And then the second half allows you to get any questions answered. So just so that you know, if there are any questions for our speaker tonight, if you look to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A icon. So if you have any questions, please just enter them there. If you happen to be having any technical difficulties, please just enter those into the chat and Christian can give you a hand. He's actually posted the link in the chat right now if you're interested to our website that has all of the archived webinars there. And we are just going to run a short poll, as we always do, just to find out who is in the audience. So I will just wait for Christian to put that up. Great. Okay, thanks so much. So for this evening's webinar, I'm really pleased to announce that we have Leslie Birkett back with us again, who's going to be talking about return to work following concussion. So Leslie is a graduate of Queen's University and has worked over 35 years in brain injury rehabilitations with both children and adults in settings ranging from acute care to the community. Leslie, has operated her own private practice since 1995. She currently also has a part-time contract in our province's northwest for the Sioux Lookout First Nations Health Authority. In addition to clinical work, Leslie is an Adjunct Assistant Clinical Professor in the McMaster University Faculty of Health Sciences Occupational Therapy program. She is a hub member for University Health Network's Project Echo Concussion. Leslie enjoys collaborative community-based rehabilitation using a participate to learn approach and thrives on situations that challenge her creativity and use of best practices. She strives to assist her clients with meeting their personal life goals. Leslie is passionate about global health and has volunteered as an OT in India, Ukraine, and Vietnam. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie.
Thank you. So I am going to share my screen, so bear with me here. All right. Now, why is this? Okay, so do you see the slide? I don't know. There. How's that?
Yes,
Is that
looks
good?
great, Leslie.
Okay, thank you. All right. So thanks very much, Leslie, for the introduction, and thank you to the Canadian Concussion Center for asking me here to speak tonight. Thanks to all of you for joining on this Tuesday evening right before Christmas and the holiday season. So I'm really pleased to be speaking to you tonight about a topic that I'm passionate about, which is helping people return to meaningful activity. And of course, that includes work, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I won't introduce myself further because you've already heard way too much from Leslie. So the learning objectives for tonight's session, by the end of this session, participants will be able to name the typical difficulties associated with return to work and describe ways to combat and or accommodate the difficulties. And I wanted to point out that I will be speaking about two somewhat separate pathways. The first for those individuals who are returning to work in a relatively early period following a concussion, and then those who return later in time and may be suffering from prolonged symptoms. So the first learning objective is to name the typical difficulties associated with return to work. So the vast majority of individuals do return to work following concussion. And as you'll see, as cited on the slide from an article, at about 6 months following injury, 80% of individuals have generally returned to work, which means that at 6 months following concussion, about 20% of people had not returned to work. And in this particular study, the authors identified that the more complicated the neuropsychological profile, the more the return to work period is extended. And the title of the slide is all about messiness. And why is that? Well, partially it's based on the definitions used in the research. So particularly when we think about work, work is not a binary yes/no question. So the issue here relates to, what did the study look at? Did it look at people returning to work? Did it look at returning to the same job? Did it look at returning to work with accommodations? And also, how long did they follow the subjects? Because one thing we know is that employment stability, so maintaining the work position, is of concern with this population. So there's a variety of factors that are related to employment status following concussion, and different researchers focus on different factors. Certainly over the past many recent years, the volume of literature in concussion has exploded. So there's lots of research going on, which is really exciting. So going back to 2006, for example, a group of authors researched initial symptom load, and they looked at how that related to individuals returning to work. And what they found, which I'm sure is not surprising, is that the more symptoms an individual identified early on, that was negatively correlated with returning to work. Now, if we fast forward in time to a 2023 Norwegian study, the authors found that there's a relative consensus regarding importance of factors such as age, injury severity, and premorbid psychiatric diagnoses. And those are the ones that are checked off on the slide there. That those are sort of well known as predictors of work outcome. And they also identified that a higher initial symptom load was negatively associated with work participation. So we can see the continuity there over many years of research. So the particular factors on the slide comes from a study that looked at employment stability after brain injury. Now, they looked at the whole range of brain injury, not just concussion. And they found that the injury severity was more predictive of the person returning to work, and factors relating to the nature of the pre-injury employment, that was more influential in the person's ability to maintain their employment over time. So I think this is really interesting because it's starting to look more and delve more into the workplace factors, which are some important things to consider. So taking a step back, I want to look at some of the common symptoms that we know about following concussion. So one of them, of course, is mental fatigue, and we know this is a common complaint after concussion. And this group of Chinese researchers evaluated just over 100 people with a first concussion, and these individuals were more than 3 months post-injury. And they found that memory and processing speed correlated to the person's ability to return to productivity. And they also found that these associations could be partially attributed to mental fatigue, even after adjusting for things such as the person's age and gender. So this is really important because we want to ensure that the person has had a really good evaluation of their fatigue, and any treatments that are required for this are addressed prior to considering return to work. So what about pain? Another really common sequelae of concussion is post-traumatic headache, and that is known to be linked to long-term outcome. And so after brain injury, headache is also one of the most common symptoms that is reported. And headache has also been shown to compromise cognitive functioning following concussion. So that, of course, then in turn can predict return to work. So the study on this slide was a Canadian study of over 100 participants, and they were recruited from an outpatient center in British Columbia. And the researcher found that headache was significantly associated with return to work, in that headache negatively affected return to work. So we've now looked at two very common symptoms following concussion and found that both of them are linked to poorer work outcome. So I wanted to draw us back for a minute because I'm sure during these webinars you've heard about the vicious cycle. Now this is an old slide because we don't call it post-concussion syndrome anymore. We call it prolonged symptoms following concussion. And we can see here as a reminder that a person has their initial injury, so the initial concussion, and that sets off a constellation of symptoms. And then over time, for example, if we look at someone who has impaired sleep, we know that when people are tired, that affects their ability to pay attention, which in turn can cause other cognitive symptoms like problems remembering. That can cause a person to feel stressed, which causes anxiety and muscle tension, which leads to increased pain and physical symptoms, looping right back around. So it's really important to consider this vicious cycle and to also really think about trying to address those individual symptoms as best as possible before looking at helping someone back to work. So the information on this slide is from the Living Concussion Guidelines, and we can see here factors that influence recovery following concussion. And we can see that there's a significant overlap with some of the factors that I've already mentioned in terms of return to work. So there is an overlap there, as we've talked about. So the guidelines, the Living Concussion Guidelines, state that regarding return to work, we should encourage people to return to some form of work, so long as work doesn't place the person at risk of re-injury. We want to facilitate identification of necessary restrictions, and that's where there's a risk of re-injury, and appropriate work accommodations by clearly identifying the person's symptoms and functional limitations. And when we do this, we want to think about functional limitations across all domains, so physical, cognitive, psycho-emotional. So we've talked a little bit about factors related to outcome. What about barriers to returning to work? Well, barriers are things like the cognitive factors. So you can see thinking, concentrating, understanding, remembering, planning, organizing, multitasking, fatigue, persistent symptoms that affect the person's ability to do their specific job. Invisibility of the injury, I think, is a really important one because I hear that from a lot of people that, their colleagues might say that they look the same. And also when the person doesn't have advice and guidance on returning to work. So thinking about the cognitive barriers, let's take a glimpse at our current world of work and look at typical skills necessary for jobs in today's world, work world. Sorry, tripping over my tongue. The information on this slide is from ads just gathered from ZipRecruiter. And we can see here skills like organization, communication, ability to multitask, to collaborate, to behave professionally, to manage a fast-paced work environment, which is probably 100% of jobs out there nowadays, to be able to learn and to be self-motivated. So essentially what we have are many higher level cognitive and executive functioning skills are necessary to survive in today's work world. And that's why return to work can be really tricky. So the Living Guidelines identify that if an evaluation is required to help someone return to work, they should focus on executive functioning, attention, memory, information processing, and verbal skills, because these were found to increase the likelihood of a successful return to work. And we can see from these job ads why that makes sense. So to summarize, our first learning objective was to name the typical difficulties associated with return to work. And what we know is that the risk factors for poor outcome after concussion are diverse and complex and do relate to outcome related to work. I don't want to finish there though. I do want to think about what is helpful, and that is support from family, friends, and the treatment team, and also employers who provide accommodation. And we're going to speak more to that as I move along tonight. So the second learning objective is to describe ways to combat and or accommodate the difficulties. Why? Well, employment is an important determinant of health, and medically unnecessary delays in return to work should be avoided because employment is an important determinant of health. An unsuccessful return to work can have profound negative economic and psychosocial consequences for affected individuals. Therefore, remaining at or promptly returning to some form of productive work, provided it does not pose a risk of re-injury, should be encouraged. And that's from the Living Guidelines, that statement that I just made. So when? Well, most people can begin the return to work process within the first few weeks post-injury. So the guidelines state that after a brief period of rest, which is considered 24 to 48 hours, patients with concussion should be encouraged to gradually resume normal activities, and this includes work. So workers with symptoms that are present but don't change with an increase in work and work-like activities can begin to transition back to work. And it's really important to note that it's not necessary to be symptom-free to return to work. So if possible in a specific situation, the healthcare professional's job is to help those individuals who are able to begin an early return to work and to consider beginning them with full-time hours with progressive duties to minimize the workplace disruption and rapidly rebuild the person's routine. So I wanted to share a few slides now that look to that issue of early return to work. So this graph is pictured from a Finnish study. And in this study, they looked at over 100 patients. And one can see here a really rather rapid return to work, with over 50% of the individuals having returned within the first 2 weeks and 94.5% having returned by 11 weeks. So the researchers here noted significant differences in return to work rates in studies from different countries, and they noted that past researchers have reported that people who have expectations that their symptoms will resolve quickly actually have shorter recovery times. So this points to another key concussion treatment tenet, which is that it's really important to provide education early on regarding symptoms and symptom resolution, and to continue to provide education as we follow our clients along. And here's a second graph that's quite like the first one. And again, this highlights the importance of early return to work based on the number of people who return after about 6 to 12 weeks. So if we look at this graph, the top line represents that the people are returning to work, and the bottom line represents the probability of the person returning to work within the next week. And the diagonal line that slices through the graph represents the probability of the person ever returning to work. And we can see it's quite low at 1 year. It's not down to 0, but it's low. And at 2 years, it's basically non-existent. So there is a short window of opportunity to re-normalize life for the majority of individuals after their concussion. That being said, there is hope for those individuals who don't return in the initial period. Those, as an occupational therapist, those are typically the people that I see. So this is again from the Living Concussion Guidelines. Will be helpful for those who work in primary care. It's something you can print off and use, and it provides some questions to think about regarding the demands of the job and safety concerns, and suggestions for when to consider a vocational evaluation. So prior to returning an individual to work, it's really important to understand the worker's rights. And in Canada, disability is a protected ground against discrimination and harassment. So with that in mind, and provided it's safe to do so, in most cases, the employer has a duty to provide reasonable job accommodations for the employee to the point of undue hardship. And specifically in Ontario, legal protections for workers fall into 4 broad areas: fair treatment at work, protection of health and safety, duty to accommodate, and income replacement. So this slide, or one similar to it, is probably familiar to many. And this really, I wanted to put up there because I think it's a great image for the duty to accommodate, because it recognizes that what we're aiming for is equity, not equality where we give everyone the same thing, but equity so that people may all participate to their full ability. So what does the return to work process look like? So right now I'm thinking of individuals who perhaps have a more prolonged return to work. But for these individuals, we want to aim for a gradual progressive process. And the Institute for Work and Health has some nice resources. And some key principles to think about are to develop an individualized return to work plan, and that goes for anyone who has a concussion, to ensure communication with the workplace, to hold a return to work meeting with key stakeholders, and to recognize that the return to work process might not be linear. So let's look more specifically at roles during this return to work process. And this again is from the Living Guidelines. So you can see here that the healthcare professional's job is to identify the restrictions, identify the limitations, again looking at all different domains, and identify and document the symptom triggers. The employer's responsibility is to review the information on the restrictions, limitations, and symptom triggers, and review information on job demands and identify opportunities for accommodations and work modification. And the employer and worker together formulate the progressive return to work plan. Now, for those individuals with prolonged symptoms who might be involved in rehabilitation, typically we're involved in helping formulate this plan because it's a little less straightforward sometimes. So I wanted to now slip back and look at some of those definitions that I've mentioned a few times. So the first one is restrictions. So restrictions are needed if there's a risk of harm that encompasses any situation where performance error in a physical or decision critical task could result in injury to the worker, co-workers, or the general public, and or disruption of equipment, production, or the environment. So for example, we can think if someone has a balance impairment that we would have a restriction for this person not to work on ladders or at heights. And if the individual had impaired concentration, we might identify no operating heavy equipment or no driving. And limitations, what are these? Well, these are activities that the person physically, psychologically, and or cognitively is unable to perform. They may not pose a risk to the worker or others per se, but would reasonably interfere with the person's ability to perform a given task. So we can think about headaches. We might want to limit heavy or repetitive lifting, limit computer time. For irritability, we might want to avoid customer service. For photophobia, we might want to identify things like avoiding brightly lit environments, avoiding fluorescent lighting, limiting screen time. So the limitations are linked, to the symptom triggers. So for example, headaches that are caused by excessive computer use, the headache would be the limitation and the accommodation would be to decrease the computer time, possibly to use an anti-glare screen and or provide an ergonomic evaluation of the workplace. So what about the difference between graduated hours and graduated duties? Well, for primary care providers dealing with those individuals who are returning to work early in the post-injury phase, you do really want to carefully consider this differentiation. And ideally, you want to be able to review a copy of the person's job description to assist with those decision making if you have opportunity to do so. So what is the difference? Well, and what are some points to consider? You do need to consider on a case-by-case basis, but in most cases you want to look at full-time hours with progressive duties. And this is considered optimal because it provides the best opportunity for active rehab. It rapidly reinstates the person's routine, it helps improve self-esteem, and minimizes workplace disruption, which constrains psychosocial relationships in the workplace and pose new barriers to return to work. So this might look something like week 1, 2 hours of regular duties and 6 hours of modified. Week 2, 4 hours of regular and 4 hours modified, etc. So it's important to remember to combine this with ongoing patient education regarding symptoms and outcomes and to follow the person along as they progress through their return to work. Well, what about those with prolonged symptoms? So these are people, in general, whose symptoms have not resolved by about a month. And estimates vary. It is considered a small percentage, maybe 15 to 20% of individuals who go on to suffer from prolonged symptoms. And for persons with prolonged symptoms, a referral for specialized assessment and or interdisciplinary concussion services might be indicated. So again, these are the kinds of individuals who I see, and return to work still is possible, and even after a year off work. So I think it's important that we don't give up hope. But the return to work process can look different for these individuals. So when I develop a return to work plan, I always do so in conjunction with the worker. They're of course the expert on their job. And in my experience, if we're thorough and detailed, often the workplace is kind of relieved to have something to use and will accept the plan as written. So on the screen, you can see a sample of the type of information that I include in return to work plans. So you can see the person's symptoms, so fatigue and headache, irritability, difficulty tolerating bright lights and computer screens, reduced concentration. And then we've talked about the specifics in the job and what we might be able to consider modifying for these issues. So for example, for fatigue and headache, we've identified that the person should have a part-time graduated return to work. They might require intermittent work breaks between tasks and extra time for task completion. We've noted that both physical and cognitive activities can cause fatigue. We've advocated for a private or quiet office space and to avoid heavy lifting. So after identifying those factors, then we look at the return to work steps. So for this person, we started the person returning to the work for 4 hours per day, 3 days per week for 4 weeks, with a flexible start time starting at 10 a.m. and a reevaluation prior to the next planned increase. So the question comes up, well, when do we think about increasing work hours? And I often find it is 4 to 6 weeks. And what we need to think about is that the person's symptoms, we will expect them to increase with increased activity. And I advise people of that before they return to work so it's not a shock for them. And then we want their symptoms to return to baseline before increasing their hours. So this needs to be flexible and fluid. And also the person has to be aware of their baseline level of symptoms before beginning the process. So meaning how long can they do a task before symptom exacerbation? So it's really important to try and have hammered out the details in the plan as best as possible through trial. So for example, this person, we have maximum 1 hour of computer work and then a change in task. And that was determined with the person trying this at home. So we always try and mimic work tasks as best we can prior to returning to work, knowing that of course the demands at work are going to be significantly higher. So we can think about things like someone who needs to take minutes at a workplace meeting can practice taking notes during the news. And again, it's important, I want to highlight, to reevaluate and continue to follow the worker to make any necessary changes and adaptations. Um, One of the references I've provided for you is a study that followed individuals over a 4-year period. And this study highlighted that 1 in 5 individuals with concussion struggle to meet the demands of their work over the longer term, and that these individuals may exit the workforce or participate with reduced work hours. And this may point to the need for long-term accommodations. And I think that's one of the things I'm seeing more and more in the literature is the need for these accommodations to be long-term, not just through the transition back to work. So what kinds of accommodations are we talking about? Well, this was a study from 2020, a British study, and it was a retrospective analysis of 170 individuals. Again, this was of people with with varying severity of brain injury. And they found that at 1 year post-injury, about a quarter of the participants continued to need work accommodations. So the accommodations, you can see the categories on the slide there. They looked at a phased return to work, having more work breaks, a reduced workload, less responsibility, and that might highlight a change in position, the need for more supervision, and the ability to work from home and receiving outside help. Now, the ability to work from home has been one of the silver linings of COVID. That is quite an easy accommodation to get now. Didn't used to be so many years ago. Another study added that a predictable work schedule was beneficial. So I think that's important to think about when we're considering shift workers. So again, some literature finds that accommodations are temporary, but we do want to think about this because some of the research is showing that people may need this for a longer term. So there was another study out of New Zealand, and they found that the rates of unemployment at 4 years post-injury, they compared that to the general population, and it was higher in the post-concussed population, but they did note that ongoing accommodations were helpful. So for those people who were working, this was really beneficial. And they found it was things like increased use of note-taking, more time to process information, increasing rest breaks to manage their fatigue, and reduced work hours were all helpful. So a 2024 study that I looked at found that employees and managers really struggled to determine workload due to the person's ongoing challenges with the need for increased work breaks, also with difficulty multitasking and work speed. So again, I think this points to two things that I've mentioned. One is the need to follow people for a while, if at all possible, and two is the need for longer term evaluations. And sorry, longer term accommodations. So one of the things we want to think about is the last couple of slides we've talked about workplace accommodations. And we do want to think about different strategies that we can help people with. So these are adaptation of work tasks and also education and coaching. So these are important factors to consider. We want to think about both the employee and the workplace. Both are important. And as a therapist, I think it's really important that we try strategies ahead of time so that the person's returning to work with strategies that they've practiced and that they know work. And then as we go forward, as work tasks continue to get or new tasks get added, then we look at the tasks if the person's struggling with it and think about strategies that will work for that specific task. So again, this is an ongoing process. I did want to highlight this best practice resource from the Brain Injury Guidelines, the Living Concussion Guidelines. This is for individuals who are considering returning to work following a concussion, and it provides some general ideas to consider regarding return to work, some information about symptoms at work and how restrictions and accommodations might work, and it also provides some additional resources. So this is something great that you can print off and hand out to people. I also wanted to showcase this resource from British Columbia. So it contains some simple and practical resources. For example, this guide, which is on the screen on the right-hand side, which provides suggestions for progressing tolerances to support return to work. Well, what about our teens? So of course, most of them are all about the money, but kids should be prioritizing return to school because that's their main job. So we want to prioritize return to learn before considering things like return to work and return to sport. So return to learn is really important. We do need to remember that teens also may need some job accommodations in order to return to work. So that's something to think about. And of course, we'd be remiss without considering those individuals for whom return to work is not possible. So when prolonged post-concussive symptoms pose a barrier to return to pre-injury employment, introduction of other meaningful activities that facilitate recovery should be considered. So we want to think about other employment, full or part-time, educational activities, community roles, and activities that promote community integration, such as volunteer work. These may all be considered as an alternative focus for meaningful activities. And wrapping it up, so work has many benefits for the individual, and the goal of the return to work plan is for the worker to fully participate in work tasks while remaining below symptom exacerbation levels. Return to work plans need to be specific and include restrictions, limitations, and tolerances. Complex cases may require a vocational evaluation, and if symptoms preclude return to work, consider an alternative focus for meaningful activities. And then included at the end are a variety of references for you.
That was a great talk, Leslie. Thanks so much. So for anyone out there, if you want to get your questions answered, now is the time. We do have one question in here. Oh, a couple already. Liz is actually asking, could we see the last screen with resources again? So the that will be posted on the website. So you'll be able to go back to that and actually see that on the Canadian Concussion Center website. We have someone else asking, isn't it possible that the data around return to work are a bit skewed? I returned to work right away and am many years out post-concussion. If I had returned more slowly, I may have been able to focus on my recovery more. So it's difficult to know whether this individual maybe is still struggling perhaps with symptoms and thinking it's not clear.
Yeah.
I don't know. Can you speak to any part of that in terms of?
I agree. I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but in terms of the data, I think it goes back to my kind of messy slide that, it's such a broad, complex topic that it depends on perhaps what they were looking at and then also how long they followed individuals throughout the study. So I think you will get some different information depending on what you're looking at.
Okay, great. We have another question. How do people get access to your services? I think they're saying I returned to work without any help or understanding of why I was having so much head pain at meetings and so forth. It would have been helpful to have a return to work plan.
Mm. So, yeah, that's a great question. So there are, for example, for occupational therapists, our provincial association keeps a list and people can go on and look for occupational therapists on it with specific expertise. The challenge is that outpatient rehab is not particularly well funded in the province. So for people who have had a concussion, typically they haven't really often had lengthy hospital stays and access rehab in the hospital setting. So there are some programs in different communities. There's some virtual programs. There's also resources such as, for example, the Ontario Brain Injury Association does have a virtual group for individuals who've had concussion and are trying to return to work, and they also have a group for employers. So it requires a little bit of digging. There are some resources out there. The Ontario Brain Injury one is newer, so that was really exciting to see that that is available and is free. I believe there's no cost, I should say, associated with that.
Hmm. Yeah, I was going to actually ask you about that because a colleague had was involved in that, and it is a free service. Um, I just wonder, I know I guess the question is whether the individual's employer is willing to participate or not. I know I've had
For
that
sure.
experience where I had a client who wanted to participate, but their employer wasn't willing. So I don't know. Have you had any experience with employers
Yeah.
or clients
So
using it?
I haven't had experience with that program because typically the people I'm seeing are not concurrently doing the OI program.
Mm,
I have had overall really good success at working with employers, but that does not mean 100%.
yeah.
um, I recently had an individual where their workplace policy was that you had to have a plan in place. This person had been off work for almost 2 years. You had to have a plan in place that returned them to full time hours and duties within 8 weeks, and that was not possible. So that was really a really challenging situation. But oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier, I find that employers are happy to have some support, because the knowledge, I think, of concussion is not great in terms of the workplace's ability to do return work. It's not one of the more common things necessarily that they've had experience returning people with. So I think often they're open to ideas and input, which is really helpful. And a lot of times, if a person's had a good working relationship beforehand, that really stands them in good stead, and the employer does want to try and make some accommodations to get the person back.
Mhm. Great. Okay, thank you. Caroline's asking, how do you advocate for frequent breaks when the employer states we are entitled to only two 15-minute breaks?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So, um, in that kind of situation, um, I would identify that, if that's the workplace policy, that's the goal that we're getting back to. But I would go back and explain, if that hasn't happened already, the rationale for the more frequent breaks. Now, sometimes you can sneak breaks in without them being a formal break, and that is, I think, is something that's worth considering also. So, for example, people can change if it's possible in the job they're doing. If they change the task they're doing, that may be a break, because we know that sometimes switching, for example, from a physical task to a cognitive task, or changing the position you're working in, those kinds of things can act as little micro breaks. Even frankly, going to get a drink of water, going to the bathroom can give a person just a little break to get moving on. So if the workplace is really rigid and they will only allow a 15-minute break, then we might look at how can we tailor what the person's doing to give them those little task changes to allow them to have a type of a break.
Okay, that's great. Someone is asking about, can you share the algorithm 12.1 link? I can't find it on the living guidelines. Now, I was just looking myself. Is that the return to work considerations algorithm, Leslie? Can you?
I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head.
Yeah,
I would be.
there's
Hmm.
actually no number on the algorithm. But if you Google living concussion guidelines and then go into the return to work section, under tools and resources, there's a whole series of different PDF documents, and I think you'll find it in there.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, okay, have you seen anyone with prolonged symptoms, that is 7 years after concussion, going back successfully to the previous work, and they're saying they used to be employed as a senior lab technologist, so haven't been off a long time.
So I have not had anybody who's been off 7 years and has not returned in any way, shape, or form come to me and work with them. So I don't have any experience with that. I have had people who have started 1 year, 2 years out and had a slow, gradual return, not necessarily to full time. But I haven't started a return to work process with someone that far out of work into their same position. Yeah, I don't know if you have, Leslie.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
That's Yeah, I can't say that I have. Uh,
Mhm.
Next question. Can an employer fire me if I fail the return to work plan?
Ah, so that is a question that requires legal advice. And this, it does sometimes we do cross over, and I do recommend to people sometimes that they may need legal advice. And I think there's different factors in that. I've had people who have been on a return to work plan, and their specific situation, they have not been allowed to be terminated. And I've had others that it's been different. So I think that's a specific question that does require more of an employment legal perspective.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Next one. FAFs, and I'm trying to think, functional assessment.
Functional.
FAFs are geared toward physical injuries and don't address brain injury symptoms, which
Mhm.
can result in misunderstandings in interpretations. I've been told that my FAF
Mhm.
says I am physically able to perform tasks and told to take Tylenol if I get headaches and go to the emergency because there must be something else wrong with me.
Oh dear, that's sorry to hear that. That's tough. So yes, typically there's many return to work assessments that really just look at the physical skills. And I think when I'm more focused on the cognitive skills, because that's of course what people struggle with from their headaches or their fatigue or whatnot. So I think you're right, and I think we do need to consider the cognitive factors. And so maybe the issue is advocating that you need to have the work tasks evaluated from the cognitive perspective to determine what the barriers are there. Because I think that it sort of goes back a little bit to the hidden aspect of concussion, right? Is that people, look fine, but we know that people can really struggle with some other thinking skills based on having had a concussion, and that can be a more significant barrier than some of the physical aspects.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Next one. When I returned to my old job, it had been discontinued.
Mm.
Is that legal? I don't know whether you can
Do not have an answer for
comment
that
on
yet.
that.
And
Yeah,
again, that's a legal.
legal. Yeah, for sure. For
Mm.
sure. How much obligation does the employer have to follow a return to work plan?
Well, once the return to work, typically, if the employer isn't happy with what's provided to them, I mean, it is their responsibility with the worker to set the return to work plan, and then to follow it because they've been involved in either setting the plan or agreeing to the plan. So if there's a feeling that the workplace isn't following it, I would think that that would be something one would want to approach, for example, human resources with to sort of find out what can be done about that. I have had some situations where that happens, but it's typically related to the type of work tasks or the volume of work. And if we sort of go back at that, typically employers are receptive, but not always. Sometimes they just want the person back in and working at full steam a little bit faster than we might recommend.
Thank you. When does one know when the plan that has been put in place is unsuccessful? How do you determine the threshold?
So I think that depends on what outcome you're looking for. So if the person, for example, was working full time beforehand and their goal was to return to full time, which is the vast majority of people, if that was the case, it depends on how many hours they can get to and how many tasks they can get to. So I wouldn't consider that I guess it's the way you look at it. I don't consider that a failure of the return to work plan. What I talk about with people is what their tolerances are. And so we maybe realize that they've reached their maximum tolerance because they can't push past those hours. And I think it's really important, and I talk to all the people I work with about this, that we think about work beyond 8 to 4. So work takes in, you got to get up, you got to get ready, you got to get there on time. And we also need to think about that return to work isn't successful if somebody's putting 100% of their energy into work, because all of us have lives outside of work and we have to grocery shop or take our kids to hockey practice or participate in our book club, and these things are all important also. So um, work doesn't tend to be it doesn't tend to last if the person's putting all their energy into work. That's not sustainable. That's the word I was looking for. It's not sustainable. So what we look at is what the person's maximum is, and when we get there, that's when we know we're finished.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. Not sure if you can answer this. What percentage of people never get back to work?
I cannot answer that because again,
Yeah,
if you look at the research, different studies have different percentages, but it also may depend on how long they follow people because as I
yeah,
mentioned, employment stability is a concern. So if it's a 2 months, 3 month study, we may miss people at the other end.
for sure. Yeah. How do you address independent contractors returning to work outside of traditional employer-employee relationships?
Mm.
Human rights code duty to accommodate still applies, but I get considerably more pushback recommending accommodations.
Yes. So thinking of an individual I'm working with right now who's an independent contractor, absolutely, because the person who is hiring the contractor at the end of the contract has no obligation to extend that contract. So we've worked behind the scenes, for example, at trying to hire some additional help, which I fully understand is a hit to the pocketbook, but the individual's goal was to maintain the position. And in that case, felt it was worth bringing on some accounting and administrative help so that they could focus their efforts and time and energy on the part of the contract that only they could do. So I think that is a really difficult one. It does put contract workers in a bit more of a precarious position because, as I said, they may not maintain that after the contract concludes.
Mhm. Does the occupational therapist have to visit the workplace to make a return to work plan?
That's a good question, and I would say not always. For example, I meet with many people virtually, so from all around the province, and I'm clearly not going to their workplaces. So, if it might depend on what they're doing, because certainly there is a role for a workplace evaluation on site. There's no question, but it depends what the individual is looking for and what kinds of accommodations they need. So, for example, if they are working on spreadsheets. I'm just picking something out of thin air. You don't need to be in the workplace to work together on figuring out what the challenges are and how to maybe modify that task. So I think it's a yes/no answer to that one.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
And Michelle is asking, can you address regression in symptoms and how to handle it after you've been performing well? How does it get addressed in the workplace if you've been released from a program?
Okay, can you sort of help clarify that for me? So,
Yeah, I think what she's saying is maybe she'd done the return to work program, had been doing pretty well. The program stopped, she's working on her own, but then for whatever reason, the symptoms start to reemerge. I don't know. Did I lose you, Leslie?
oh, there just
Oh,
froze.
okay.
Sorry. I saw you. For whatever reason, symptoms increased. Is that where we went with that?
Yeah, I think that's what she's saying is that it sounded like she'd been doing well, had finished the program and, so doesn't have the occupational therapist or anyone involved anymore, but for whatever reason, maybe some of those same symptoms
Yeah.
are exacerbated.
So that's a great question, and I have seen that happen in practice. I think we need to think about with prolonged symptoms. There's when we think about the vicious cycle, and when we also consider, concussion as a biopsychosocial phenomenon. So we have people, for example, who are doing okay, and then maybe there's a period of increased stress that could be at work, it could be at home, it could be both, and suddenly symptoms will flare. And I think what we know about long-term symptoms is that that is not an uncommon pattern. And so I think A, trying to think about it ahead of time, and then B, if we're in that situation, I've had people who have had to, use sick time to get through that. And if that's not enough, I have had the odd person who's had to go back on short term and re-enter the workplace again, a bit more gradual while they get through that hump. And ideally, while they're getting through that hump, having some treatment to help support them. So it may be returning sessions to help them manage the factors that they're dealing with.
Okay, great. Thanks, Leslie. For someone with screen intolerance in a role that is screen dependent, what strategies do you typically suggest to manage symptoms?
Mm. Yeah, so that's a great question because that's so many of us nowadays. And so I've had different people have success with different things. Some people like different colored filters or putting their computer on a different mode that will sort of change the light. There's some look at different glasses, if different colored glasses are beneficial. And this is not research based, but I've had people subjectively report that that's helpful. I think one of the other things is I have people, if it's at all possible, sometimes to print things off and read them in print form to give them a break, and also to consider looking away from the computer and giving your eyes a break is another strategy. And then the other thing is some people seem to do better with smaller screens, some people seem to do better with larger screens. So I think they're sort of playing around with that as well and considering the whole computer station and is that set up ergonomically for the individual. So those are some of the ideas that jump to mind.
Mhm. That's great. And I'll just point out, we actually had a session, Dr. Tatter did a session on issues with screens because it is very, very common. So you can actually find that if you're interested, you can look in the archived webinars and check that out. You may find some additional tips. So, well, I
Oh, that's
think
great.
that brings us to the end of the questions for this evening. So we're just a little bit ahead of time, which I think is okay. I know we're close to the holidays, and thank you again, Leslie. This is really great, and some nice comments in the chat as well. Just thanking you. So just to remind everyone, we are taking a little bit of a break. We're going to be back on January the 14th, it is. And we actually have Dr. Tatter, who's going to be back with us talking about introduction to treatment of concussion. So I also wanted to say that as a reminder from Christian, if you are already registered for the series, you don't need to re-register. You're already in our system, and I think you'll automatically get the alert once we get going with the schedule for 2025. So thank you again, everyone, for attending tonight and wishing everyone a really happy holiday and the best in the new year. And thanks again, Leslie.
You're welcome.
Have a great holiday. Take care.